Hey y'all, welcome back to Kelvin's Classroom. Today we're going to talk about the circulatory system. So a few of the things we're going to look at the different parts of the circulatory system, their structures, their functions, how they do the jobs that they do. Some of those key things we'll look at is the heart. We'll spend a decent amount of time there. We'll look at the vessels that go around the body and help deliver everything. And then we'll look at blood, the components of it and what its jobs are. So those are things we're going to take a look at. All right, so let's jump on in. First thing we're going to think about is the circulatory system. So circulatory system, when you think about this, oftentimes people also refer to it as the cardiovascular system. It is the thing that travels all the way around the body, delivering blood everywhere, with the pump being the thing that's pushing it. An easy way to think about this is you can kind of think about it like a country's road system, right? So the road system goes all over the country, allows things to move around different places. That's what our circulatory system does. Now, we have different types of circulatory systems that we can think about in different organisms. So we can think about a single circulatory system or a double circulatory system. So a single circulatory system is one open system that travels around the body in one pathway. So fish are common examples of this. Lots of other things like an axolotls, a common example we talk about for this, or insects, things like that, where the blood is traveling in one circular pattern, right? It goes through a heart or something similar to a heart, is pumped to the body or pumped to the lungs or anywhere else where it's getting that oxygen from, and then comes back and just keeps going. It's very uncontrolled in the way that it does that because it can just travel freely between any of those open spaces, right? The double circulatory system, which is what humans have, mammals have, a lot of more large complex organisms have this. It's where we have a heart that is separated into two different sides, the left side and the right side. And what happens with the blood inside double circulatory systems is when it leaves the heart one time, it travels to the lungs where it's going to pick up that oxygen, and it's also going to get rid of any of those waste that it needs. Then it goes back to the heart. Then the second time it pumps the heart, so double, second time it leaves, it's going to the body and it's delivering all of the things that need to be delivered to the body, collect any of the waste, coming back to the heart, and then starting back over by making that trip back up to the lungs. So single circulatory system, just one pump taking it anywhere around the body, and then it comes back to the heart. Double circulatory system, it's going to two different places. One, it's going to the body, and then second time, it's going to the lungs. That way it can pass on and exchange that gas. So two different systems. They each have advantages and disadvantages. So if we're thinking about advantages of a single circulatory system, it's easier, it's smaller, it's simpler. It can pass things quickly back to the body. It doesn't have to make longer journeys, doesn't have to travel through the heart twice. So we're less space needing to be taken up by the heart, less complications in needing to be in the heart. It can be a very simple structure. Whereas the advantages of a double circulatory system is it's more efficient, right? Every time we're delivering blood to wherever it's going, it's ready for it. If it's going to the lungs, it's deoxygenated. It's ready to pick up oxygen. If it's going to the body, it has that oxygen that it can deliver, right? So differences depending on the size and complexity of the organism depends on which system would be better for it. So what is the purpose of the circulatory system in humans or in other organisms like large mammals and animals or anything really? So the purpose of the circulatory system is to help deliver things around the organism's body, collect things, move them to different areas, right? It's the delivery system. It takes things from one place and moves it to another place and helps things move around. Right, so if I'm thinking about a human, when I take a breath, that air comes in from my mouth and down into my lungs. I need to get all of that oxygen delivered all over my body. It needs to get down to my toe, right? When I take a big breath, it's not going to make it all the way down to my toe. It's just making it into my lungs. It needs some way, some system of being able to be delivered to those different places. And in the opposite manner, when I use things and I create waste or need to move things from a different part of the body, I need that system to be able to move it back. So we need a really big, large, complex, spread out system to be able to deliver everything around the body. That's what the circulatory system's there for. So if we're thinking about the circulatory system, the first place we really probably want to stop is the heart, right? The heart's kind of like the engine that drives all of it, right? It's what keeps pushing things along, moving things along. And most of the time when someone thinks about an organ inside the human body, heart is one of the main ones we think about. It's one of the most known ones, right? Now, normally when we think about a heart, we think about the nice little drawing of a heart in that shape. But the actual anatomical heart that we have inside our body is a little bit different shaped, okay? So its shape and structure is it's a muscle a hollow muscle, so it has a lot of empty space on the inside that allows blood to travel in and out, and it's split up into different parts. So earlier I said that we're a double circulatory system, which means we have a left side and a right side, but it's also a double pump, which means we have a top and a bottom part, right? So if we were to think about it, whenever we're looking at the heart and thinking about it and thinking about what the parts of it are, we think about it from the perspective of whoever's heart that is, not from us looking at it, but from the person whose heart it is, right? So the left side of the heart would be the person who has the heart, their left side. The right is the other side. Up at the top, we have the atrium on both the left and the right side. And down at the bottom, we have the ventricle on both the left and the right side. And we've got some new words here, atrium and ventricle. So to help remember this, atrium is at the top, just like A is at the top of the alphabet, and ventricle is at the bottom. And when you look at it, it makes a V at the bottom of the ventricle. You can kind of see that little V in the shape of each of those ventricles. Another way of remembering which one's the atrium and the ventricle, which actually helps us a lot when we start to think about the function of the heart, is the atrium is where blood arrives at the heart. Atrium, arrive, both start with A. And then the ventricle is where blood leaves the heart. Ventricle starts with a VE, leave ends with a VE. That'll help us organize and structure where things are coming and going inside the heart as we think about this complex structure. So we have 4 chambers, left and right atrium, left and right ventricle. Each of them do their own job. Overall, the purpose of it is to collect blood, pump it out, and deliver it to wherever it's headed. Now, I said we're going 2 different places, right? So one time when it's leaving the heart, it's going to the lungs. One time when it leaves the heart, it's going to the rest of the body. Now, if we think about how hard it might be to send something to the lungs, which are really close to the heart, or to the rest of the body, which it can be a long ways away from the heart, we think one has a much harder job, right? So it would make sense that if I need to send something all the way to the body, I probably need to be a little bit stronger, and therefore a little bit thicker muscle, than if I'm sending it to the lungs. And that's the case in the heart, right? So the heart, the left side of the heart is thicker than the right side of the heart, if we're looking at the walls, and that's because it's sending it a lot farther distance. So another way of helping us organize this, the left side is delivering to the body, which means that it's going to have blood inside it that has oxygen already, because it's already came from the lungs. It just returned from the lungs. The right side of the heart is going to have blood inside it that doesn't have oxygen in it. So it's going to be, we call it deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood. It's on the right side of the heart. Right, so now we're starting to understand the structure and the function a little bit better of the heart. Let's take a look at the actual functioning of the heart as it's beating. So as we see it beating, we can see blood arriving into the heart, and the top part, the atrium, is the first place that it arrives. It starts to fill up. We're immediately seeing blood fill down into the ventricles as well, and then the atrium goes ahead and contracts, which contract just means it squeezes, the muscles tighten up, they're doing work at this time, and we pump the blood down into the ventricle, where the ventricle then becomes fairly full of blood while it's relaxed, and it begins contracting to pump the blood out of the heart. So it goes atrium, ventricle, outside the heart, in a little bit of a rhythm of contraction and contraction. When we think about these contractions, they start at what we call the natural pacemaker, right? This is the SA node, sinoatrial node, which starts at the top left part of the heart. After that contraction, it passes an electrical signal impulse down to right between the atrium and the ventricle to another node. Now this one's a little bit easier to remember because it's between the atrium and the ventricle. It's called the AV, atrioventricular node. It builds up some more of an electrical impulse, and then it causes the ventricle to contract by sending that electrical signal down the center of the heart, spreads back out around the apex of the heart, and causes those muscles to contract, forcing the blood up and out. That's the direction we want it to go. We don't want to contract that blood down into the heart because there's not an exit there. The exit's up at the top. Now, when we're thinking about blood exiting or entering the heart, we've talked about where it arrives and where it leaves from, but where's it entering from and leaving from, right? So if we continue looking at the structures of the heart, we can see blood is arriving at the heart in 2 little vessels. These are called veins. Anytime something is going towards the heart, it's called a vein, right? Any of those vessels that are headed towards the heart, they're called a vein. And the ones that enter the heart, if we're thinking about the left side of the heart, which is the side that has oxygen-rich blood, meaning it just came back from the lungs, we call this the pulmonary vein. The word pulmonary means relating to the lungs. So it's the vein that's related to the lungs, that has to do with the lungs. So coming from the lungs towards the heart or headed into the heart is the pulmonary vein, right? It then travels through the atrium, down to the ventricle, and then it leaves the heart and it's headed towards the body. Now, if we're headed to the body, we talked about that being the biggest part, the largest amount needing to go there. So this is our large artery. We call it the aorta. And all the aorta means is it means it's the main trunk. It's that big, large artery that's leaving. And you can tell when you look at it, it's actually really, really large. It's the largest out of any of the vessels that are anywhere near the heart. It's the largest one that we have. And it actually makes a little arch, and we call it the aortic arch. And you can see little branches coming off of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening with the arteries and the veins and stuff later. For now, we're just going to focus on that's the aorta that's leaving the left side of the heart. Okay, well, it travels through all the arteries, going around the body, makes its way back up towards the heart the second time. Now it's coming back into the heart again. This time it's going to be without oxygen, so it's going to turn to the right side of the heart. And when it enters, it's a vein. It's a big vein, right? Just like the big artery took it away, it's a big vein bringing it back. And for this, we call it a vena cava. And vena cava is simply just referring to a really large vein. It actually means a hollow vein in Latin, but it's just talking about the really large one. What you can see is we actually have two different veins that meet together to be the vena cava. We have one that's on the top and one that's on the bottom. They're, as you would predict, collecting blood from the top part of the body and the bottom part of the body. We call these the superior and the inferior vena cava. Just means the above one or the top one and then the bottom one, and that's where they're collecting it from. They meet, pour the blood back into the heart in the vena cava, goes into the atrium, again, travels down to the ventricle, and then it leaves to go back to the lungs again, which if it's an artery relating to the lungs, this is where that helped us learning what pulmonary meant. It's the pulmonary artery, the artery relating to the lungs. And that carries the blood back up to the lungs. So now we've made one complete circle. We see what's happening in here. We can see all the little bits of the heart, where it's arriving, where it's leaving, all of those important parts. The only thing we haven't talked about is the heart has a few valves that keep it from backing up when it's in there. Because if I'm just contracting, right, I'm squeezing muscle in. If we imagine a bottle, right, and I take the lid off the bottle and I squeeze it, the water's going to go out in the direction that I anticipated. But if I have a bottle that has two holes, which would be similar to the atrium, the ventricle, both of these have holes on both sides of it, and I were to squeeze that plastic water bottle, I can't really control which way the water's going, and I need to have control over it. It wouldn't be good for my heart if it contracts and pumps and blood goes the opposite direction. I don't want that. That's not helpful for me. So I need to make sure it keeps traveling in one direction. This is really, really vital. We're going to keep coming back to this. Whenever we think about adaptations of the circulatory system, making sure that it's going one way is usually a really important one that we'll talk about regularly, right? So to make sure that it keeps going in one direction, we have these valves that are a part of them. Now, all these are things that keep things going in one direction. So it will allow flow one direction. It won't allow it the other direction. You can kind of think about this like a door, right? Most doors, especially when you go into like buildings and stuff like that, they open one direction, but they won't open back out the other direction. That's what's happening here, right? It'll allow things in, but then once the pressure on the inside gets too much, we have too many people inside, they're pushing back against that door, it keeps it closed, keeps it from going back the other direction. That's what happens in these valves, right? Keeps things flowing in one direction. We have 4 valves that are in the heart, right? So these 4 valves are located between the atrium and the ventricle, and then between the ventricle and the artery. Now, the reason we have them located here and we don't have them anywhere else, the atrium is happy to keep collecting blood. It at no point wants to stop blood from entering the heart. So we don't want to stop anything coming from the veins. We want to allow it to keep coming in, right? We don't want, when that ventricle has that big contraction, anything to go back, because it's going to have a big change in pressure. It's going to have a big contraction, big change in pressure. We don't want to see any of the blood going back into the atrium. And then after it finishes that contraction and it relaxes again, since the ventricle is such a large chamber, there's going to be another really big pressure difference. We don't want any of the blood to come back from the arteries, right? So we want to stop it from coming in that direction. We want to just keep it traveling in one direction. Now, between the atrium and the ventricle, we have our AV valves. The one on the left side, which if we remember, that's the side that has that oxygen-rich blood, that one's the mitral valve. Sometimes it's referred to as a bicuspid because when you look at it, there's just two parts that you can see, two different lips to it that you can see. That's separating the atrium from the ventricle. And then as we're leaving and we're going into, where are we going into from the left side, oxygen-rich, what artery are we going into? That's that aorta, that big one. That's gonna be your aortic valve. Right, so the valve related to the aorta. On the right side, however, again, we have an AV valve between the atrium and the ventricle. If we look at this one, it has three little parts to it, so we call it our tricuspid valve, tri meaning three, so tricuspid valve, and then after we're leaving the ventricle, on our way out, it's our pulmonary valve because it's going into the pulmonary artery. Right, so both of those valves' names are linked to the artery that they're going into, or they're the AV valve, and you can just think about the name of them based on how many parts there are, either the bicuspid or the tricuspid valve. So a little bit of a complicated thing, but it's not too hard. Now, how do we keep these from flipping back the other way? Well, one, the shape that they're in, it helps because as that pressure pushes, they push in against each other and they just become a bit more rigid and keep anything from going the other way. They also have these little strings attached to them, right? When you hear someone talk about saying you're tugging on my heartstrings, these are the strings that are attached to them. It's kind of like an arm attached to them that keeps them from flipping the other way to keep everything traveling in one direction, which is exactly what we want. That's good. That's what we want. So that's more or less the heart that we need to focus on, at least to this point. We can think about what happens in it, what the structures are, how it goes about doing it, thinking about some of the adaptations that it has, right? Valves are a good adaptation that keep it going one direction. The ability for it to stretch and contract allows it to take in more blood and push more blood in that one direction. Having a receiving chamber and a delivering chamber is really good. Helps us keep things going in the same direction. We have in the middle of it that septum that keeps the left side and the right side separated so we don't have that oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood mixing against each other to help be more efficient when we're delivering things or receiving things. Those are some of those big differences. Now, another thing that's a really key important adaptation about it is on the inside, it's gonna have fine layer on that inner layer of it to keep it from absorbing any of the oxygen from it. Now, the heart is a muscle and it does need to get oxygen and glucose and get rid of carbon dioxide and urea. All of these things need to be delivered, but it can't steal it from the inside. Otherwise, the rest of the body won't get it. It will just keep taking it. So it needs to have its own external supply of blood, and we'll talk about that later. The coronary artery, which delivers blood to the heart itself, extremely important, right? When we start talking about coronary heart disease, we'll look into the coronary artery and how it can have some effects there, but it has its own blood supply. It doesn't steal it from the inside. It delivers it all and then collects it later. Those are those main adaptations, though, that we're seeing inside the heart to help it do its job better. Oh, and one other big adaptation it has is that ability to make its own electrical impulse, right? So we call that it's myogenic. It can generate its own electrical impulse. So it doesn't need anything else to help it do its regular pumping, about 60 beats per minute, about maybe a little bit more, up to 80 beats per minute, regularly just pumping over and over and over. So that way it has that nice rhythm. It doesn't need the rest of the body to do it. So if we were thinking about an open heart surgery, we could remove the heart from the body, and as long as we keep providing it with blood that's rich in oxygen and all the nutrients that it needs and removing everything else, it'll keep beating without the rest of the body. Now the brain's there to help regulate it at times, and we don't go into a lot of detail around how the other body and the hormones can help speed it up or slow it down, but it on its own can just keep its own rhythm, keep its own beat. And in fact, the two nodes have their own different speeds. But if you're really interested in looking at that, you can go ahead and check out my A-level video talking about it. We go into a bit more detail there. So that's the heart. Now we need to talk about the vessels, right? So these are like the roads spread out all over the country that allow things to be delivered all over the place. Now, like the heart having a chamber that receives and delivers, the same is true inside the vessels. We talked about two of those main different valves, those two main vessels. We talked about arteries and veins. We said how arteries take blood away from the heart. It starts with an A, so does away. So arteries take blood away from the heart, and veins take blood towards or return it into the heart. So these are our two main big ones. Oftentimes you'll hear people say something that isn't really fully correct, and they say arteries carry oxygen-rich blood, veins don't. That's not really true. Now, the reason we say that is because throughout most of the body, if it's an artery, it's going to be oxygen-rich blood. But if we think back to talking about the heart, when we're on our way to the lungs, it's oxygen poor, and it's in an artery. So the pulmonary artery carries oxygen-poor blood. The rest of the arteries in our body are going to have that oxygen-rich, but in that journey there, it's not. So it's much better to think about arteries as whether they're going away from the heart or towards the heart, because that's correct way of thinking about it. Now, what would be some differences that need to exist between these? Now, an artery, let's think about its job and what changes it might have based on its job. So it receives blood directly from the heart and takes it around the body. So if we think about what's happening as blood's entering an artery right out of the heart, it's under a ton of pressure. That big ventricle does a contraction and forces all of the blood in there. So it needs to be pretty strong. It needs to be able to withstand a lot of pressure as blood's being forced inside there. Another thing, it needs to travel a really long distance, right? So if blood's coming from my heart down to my toe or out to my finger, that's a long distance it needs to travel. If you were to hop into a vehicle and you're traveling a long distance, what do you probably want to do? You want to travel pretty fast to cover a long distance. So one, the pressure that it takes is going to make things going pretty fast. But another way of keeping that speed really high is we don't want it to stretch a lot. We don't want it to stretch a lot because then a lot of blood goes in, but it'll just slow down because it increases the amount of volume in there. So that thick, rigid outer layer of it helps keep it in a fairly middle, normal sized lumen, which is what we call the inside part of the artery, inside of any of the vessels, we call that the lumen. It stays at fairly regular shape. It doesn't change a whole lot. So we have a really thick wall for it, travels a really long distance, and relatively, if we're looking at the artery, it's quite large, right? It's not really very small, right? We have other vessels that are much smaller than it. So hops in the artery. This is what it looks like. We can see the image of it, fairly thick walls on there. We have different layers there. So we have the inner layer. This one we're going to see throughout all of them. We're going to see this also in the capillaries, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then we have these other layers, which are called tunica. We have these tunica layers. There are 3 of them. They're all varying different thicknesses, but their job there is just to keep the shape and structure of that artery. Right? So blood's traveling through the artery, it keeps going, it gets into a smaller little branch of it, which is what we call an arteriole. So whenever we have that OLE at the end of a science word like this, it's usually just meaning it's a smaller version. So it's a smaller version of the artery. It breaks down into a smaller version, it keeps traveling, and then it hits a capillary. Now, a capillary is a big difference. You've probably heard of this before. This is where we do all of the exchange. This is where blood can leave and enter. We can exchange gas and stuff like that. So a capillary is very, very small. It's kind of like the side streets. If we're thinking about vessels are all of the road structures, right? Our arteries are the motorways going long distances. They're fairly big. We want to travel a really long distance at a really high speed. The capillaries, these are the side roads. This is where people get in and out, do deliveries, go into their house and stuff. So only one cell can fit through here at a time. One red blood cell can fit through here at a time because they're very, very narrow, kind of like a side street. About one car can fit through there really without getting a big traffic jam, right? Pretty narrow, pretty small. It's also going to have a very thin outer layer to it. It's only one cell thick. So the reason this is really important is we want to be able to let the blood go out so we can do gas exchange. We want gas to have a really short diffusion distance, right? We want a really quick, easy diffusion for gas so that way we can exchange it quick and carry on and make sure that we're maximizing that, right? That's one of our adaptations of the capillary. Being really thin allows good diffusion, right? Also being so thin means we keep a steady stream of blood going through it. We don't have a lot of it, but it still keeps moving fairly fast, right? And then if any damage happens to it, it's not an artery where we have a lot of damage happening and a lot of blood being lost, just minimal, right? So when we're weaving our way through the muscles, damage happens quite regularly. Since they're so small, we can quickly heal it, and we're also not having a whole lot of damage happen. We're not worried about anything serious happening by damaging capillaries. If we damage an artery, serious concern there, right? Because artery has a lot of pressure, so we're losing a lot of blood at a fast rate, right? It's oxygenated blood, so we're not getting that oxygen and all the glucose and everything we need delivered to where it's going, and it keeps in rhythm with that heart. So it's really, really bad if we get an artery damage, but not such a big deal if we get a damage to the capillaries. All right, so our next one, moving on to that last one, we leave the capillaries then, and we then enter a venule, which is like the arteriole. It's a smaller version of a vein, and then we move into the veins and make our way back up to the heart. So let's take a look at the veins then. So veins, compared to the capillary, they're much larger, much larger. They're closer in size to the artery. And if you look at the lumen, that inner part, it has the largest of all the lumen. It's very, very large, but when you look at them, it's not going to be under as much pressure as the arteries are. because it's not being forced in there from the heart. It's coming back from different parts of the body at a much slower speed, right? Lazy traffic, if we're thinking about it like the motorway, lazy traffic pouring into here. Not a high speed flying out of London, just slow speed, working our way back in there, slowly picking things up as it goes. Now, if we don't have the pressure of the heart pushing it, we need to make sure that it actually makes it back to the heart. Remember how I said the circulatory system one way is a really important adaptation? This is true in the veins. So to help with this, we have valves. All through the veins, we have these little valves that keep the blood from going back the wrong direction. Just stops it. Allows it to go forward. When it tries to come back, it stops it and catches it. So that way we make sure it keeps going only in one direction. Another important aspect of the veins is that they travel through, next to, inside, surrounding muscles. And as we're walking and moving and living and just doing different things, those muscle contractions squeeze the veins and just keep pushing the blood up and up and up until it gets its way all the way back up to the heart, right? If we're comparing the thickness of the walls, much thinner walls than the artery. Thicker than the capillaries, so it's not one cell thick. We still have some of those tunica in there, but they're much thinner. They're not nearly as thick because we don't need to maintain a rigid structure. It actually is better for it if it doesn't have this thick open structure, and it can change a little bit, right? We talked about esophagus when we were talking back about digestive system. Similar, it can change its shape a little bit, just so that way it allows the right amount of blood to stay in there. It can stretch a little bit with it, and we just keep moving it forward. So these are the main vessels. They all have their differences. They're all adapted to their specific job. You can tell the differences as you just look at them and as we talked about them, right? Now, all of the circulatory system, the heart, the vessels, the job of its main purpose is to deliver things around the body. Things we're trying to deliver, hormones, right? Having long-lasting effects on things, right? We're trying to deliver oxygen so that way we can keep doing respiration. Glucose so we can do respiration. Carbon dioxide so we're removing that extra waste that we have and getting rid of it. Urea, all these things need to move around the body. How is it that they move around the body? Because they're not like a car that can just hop onto the roadway of our vessels and go driving along. We need something moving it. We need something carrying it along. So we should probably take a look at blood. That's that thing that's moving things around, carrying it where it's going, and doing all of these jobs. So blood is actually 4 different components mixed into one, right? Now, the 4 different components we have are red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Let's take a look at these. Now, the easiest one that you've heard the most about probably is red blood cells. You've been hearing about this for quite a while. Now, red blood cells are fairly large, concave shaped structures. They're circular with this concave shape. They don't contain a nucleus. Their number one job is just maximize oxygen absorption. So they have hemoglobin on them, which holds that oxygen, allows it to be delivered around the body. They're fairly flexible in shape, which is good because we don't want them to break easily as they're traveling through the capillaries. We want them to be able to squeeze into different places to deliver oxygen wherever it needs to go. They're also very thin in shape, right? I said only one of them fits into the capillaries, right? The diameter of them, yeah, about one of them fits inside a capillary. You probably can't fit 2 of them in there, but they're very thin. Now, this allows easy access to that oxygen and hemoglobin to diffuse out really easy and quick. Now, I said they have hemoglobin that takes on this oxygen. Once the oxygen attaches to the hemoglobin, we call that oxyhemoglobin, just oxygen hemoglobin, right? So it's delivering it all around the body. Based on its shape, it's really good at being able to do that. Now, red blood cells take up about 40 to 45% of the blood, right? So we think about blood, we think about it being red, we think about red blood cells, but only about 40 to 45% of it actually is made up of these red blood cells. The rest are the other parts. So let's go ahead and take a look at the other parts. So the next one we can look at are white blood cells. I kind of talked about red blood cells, white blood cells in that order. So let's take a look at white blood cells next. Now, white blood cells have a large job, very important job. Their job is our immune system. So they're there to help keep us healthy. They travel around the body. They're much larger in size and shape than the red blood cells. They also don't have the same defined shape, right? We think about red blood cells, we know exactly what it's going to look like. White blood cells don't have a set specific structure, and there are lots of type of white blood cells. White blood cells only make up about 1% of our blood, so not a lot, but they have a very huge important job. The main job is to go and engulf invading things. We'll talk about that in infection response, but these are our phagocytes. And their job is just to find anything that's inside the body that shouldn't be there, go engulf it, destroy it, break it down with some enzymes, and get rid of it. Another main type of white blood cell are lymphocytes. Now, their job is to go and make antibodies. So they go out, they find things that aren't supposed to be there as well, but instead of engulfing them, they look at them, they make antibodies that can then attach to them and either help destroy them or keep them from being able to replicate themselves. We'll talk more about this again in infection and response when we're talking about this, but this is another main type of white blood cell. Now, all in all, these white blood cells, they have this large shape to help them do this job. They're flexible in their position as well, and they're just going out looking for things to help keep us healthy. So red blood cells and white blood cells we've talked about. Let's talk about our last one that is we can consider a cell, and that would be platelets. Now, platelets' job, they're small little pieces. They're the smallest of all of the three that we've talked about. And they just travel around looking for openings and creating clots. That's their main job, is to help keep us healthy by keeping us from losing blood. So if they find an opening, any sort of cut or anything like that, they're going to start to make a clot. Now, how they do this is they have proteins inside them that they can attach to each other. It's kind of like creating a really big net. All right, so if we think about kind of like a river, we're going to use the river analogy here in a minute. So if we think about a river traveling and we set a net in it and it just starts catching things that are flowing through there, eventually it makes a really big dam. And that's what these platelets do. They find an opening, they gather up with each other, attach platelets, attach proteins to each other, make a net, and they just catch other things like red blood cells and white blood cells in the net to kind of build up a scab and a protection to keep anything from getting away. Now, again, these make up a very small percent of what's found inside our blood. Very low percent. But what makes up the majority inside our blood is plasma. Now, plasma, this is just the liquid inside there. It makes up about 55% of what's inside our blood, so the vast majority. It's not red. So actually, if we were to take it out and we were to take some blood into a sample, put it into a centrifuge, spin it out, it's actually more of a yellowish color. And it's because it's predominantly water, and it has minerals mixed into it. So we have a lot of minerals and things that just dissolve into that water. It's kind of like the river, the water in a river allowing things to flow through. So it's the reason our blood can travel and move around and flow is because of this plasma. It's what keeps things traveling along and flowing. So what are the things that diffuse into it? We have carbon dioxide that diffuses into it. So lots of times people get a little bit confused and think that oxygen is dropped off by red blood cells and then it takes in carbon dioxide into it. The carbon dioxide doesn't go into the red blood cells. It goes into the plasma. So does glucose. It just dissolves in there and it's traveled around in there. Urea builds up inside the plasma. So a lot of things being transported around are actually just transported around in the plasma. The red blood cells only are there for oxygen, right? So it dissolves into the plasma, and then as we get up to the lungs, it can then just go out of the plasma, diffuse out of the plasma into the lungs and leave. So this is a simple diffusion process that's happening here. It just diffuses straight from the cells into the plasma and is traveling around then. So this is the majority of the circulatory system. It's all the things we really need to think about right now. The heart, we talked about the heart, the structure, the functions, all of the things that are happening in there. We talked about the vessels, the 3 different types of vessels, how they're different, how they're adapted to their job, the 4 parts of blood, what all makes them do their job really well. This is it in a well-functioning circulatory system. Now, next time, we're going to take a look at when things start to go wrong. So we're going to start to look at some heart disease. We're going to look at some of these things that can go wrong in here and how we can either prevent it or treat it and what the actual effects of it are. So thanks for coming by today, guys. As always, please click subscribe. Throw a comment down there. If you have a question, ask a question, right? I really want to hear what you guys want to know so I can make sure that I'm getting all the information you guys need. And if you need me to readdress something or answer something, I'm happy to. Looking forward in the coming weeks, keep your eyes out. I'm going to start putting out some practicals where I go through and we actually look at some of these things. Some of the required practicals, so like a heart dissection, but also some of the things that maybe aren't required practicals, just some more hands-on things to get a chance to actually look at it. So keep an eye out for it. Please share this with anyone if you think it'll be helpful for them. And as always, catch you next time.